The image is emblematic, obviously. There's nothing obvious about Michelangelo in this image, but it's all about becoming acquainted with his world in a very, let's just say, flyover sort of way. Okay. So, as you know, I've asked each one of you to read this novel. This is the only absolutely necessary reading, but it is necessary. And it's actually a fairly well-written book that is essentially a novelized biography. And on Friday, we're going to be seeing a movie version. Like all movies, even more essentialized and dramatized, but mostly for the visuals, for a wonderful reconstruction of the Sistine Chapel before Michelangelo began to work on it, and a good introduction to what this early to high Renaissance world looked like. So, yes. The painting is a Russian painting by a late 19th, early 20th century painter called Viktor Vasnetsov. It's an illustration from a Russian folk tale, but emblematic because this is essentially how we're going to be studying everything. We don't have time to slug through the forests and the swamps and paddle up the rivers. We're flying over. It's dusk, as you can tell. The owls are a dead giveaway. The owls are a reference to a statement by the early 19th century philosopher Hegel, where paraphrasing an ancient saying, he says, "The owl of Minerva sets flight at dusk," which is to say, when things are difficult and about to be lost, this is when wisdom takes flight to take stock of what can be recovered. And the terrain is misty. The light of the moon is going to be the only light shortly that we'll be seeing things. So once again, searching for the way things really are is not that straightforward an enterprise, but we have our own light here. It's a lantern within which is in the Russian folk tale it's called the firebird. It's a phoenix-like creature which represents the help of the transcendent to ultimately guide us on our way. So this can be emblematic of many things. It's certainly emblematic of our enterprise here. And here is the focus of our work. Ultimately, this is a contemporary painting of Michelangelo in middle age, not in old age. As you know, he lived into his 80s. Unlike Raphael, not the most photogenic and charming of individuals, as you'll learn when you read the biography, and some reasons why. Okay, but today what we're going to be focusing on is the story of Italy leading up to and beyond Michelangelo and how it sets the stage for the Renaissance as such, and what's unique about the Renaissance, and how Italy really becomes the crucible for what happens in the Renaissance. So, this is the way Italy looked like in Michelangelo's youth in 1492, when Columbus set sail, as you know. This is what Italy looked like towards the end of his life. There's a new player, the Spanish Empire. And the agent of that empire, in a painting, a great painting by Titian, is the last great Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, who united the thrones of Spain and the Holy Roman Habsburg domains into a single domain in his lifetime, and endeavored and struggled to hold it all together while much was unraveling, as you'll learn. Now, another painting that's emblematic of the larger theme today is a painting by an English painter, Frank Dixie. The painting is circa 1900, and it's entitled The Two Crowns. And you can see the obvious crown that everybody's focused on, and the crown that he's focused on, of course, is the crown of thrones. It's a very fine painting that highlights the two fundamental sources of authority from the late Roman Empire until modern times. So, we can say the church, and we're not going to use the word state because it would be anachronistic in this context, but empire. So, the kingdom that is not of this world, but it's the kingdom that in fact frames this world and all that goes within it and is the context for it, and the kingdom of this world as it tries to maintain a relationship with the transcendent source of authority. Now, this is beautifully embodied in a crucifix, which is presently and has been, I think, since it was first made in Aachen Cathedral. Aachen, as some of you may know, was founded by Charlemagne and was the place of coronation for the Holy Roman emperors as rulers of the Frankish and successor domains. And it incorporates a gemstone and a cameo. It's called the Cross of Lothair because of the gemstone. And here we see the gemstone. Lothair was a succeeding ruler to Charlemagne, but he didn't make this artifact. And the more artistically consequential one, of course, is this cameo of Augustus, the divinized Augustus. Augustus is Jupiter. So, this is the imperial side of this cross. And the other side, less dramatic, but a great masterwork of circa the year 1000 is the crucifix engraved in line. Here you see it in a better photograph. It's hard to get actually online it's hard to get a better photograph than this. So, there we have the two realms and the two sources of authority, and the two imperial styles as well. The empire that is not of this world, and the empire that rules this world. The ultimate setting is from the High Middle Ages, as you can see. So it was a processional cross, initially probably made for the Emperor Otto II or Otto III, so circa the year 1000. And that's its prototype. Processional crosses going back to the Roman period. This is from a apse mosaic in Ravenna, the Church of San Apollinare in Classe. Classe was the port city of Ravenna, and there you see its context. So, it's a style that goes back to Roman times, like virtually everything that we will be looking at. Now, for the pagan symbol of empire, this is a stunning cameo from the 1st century of Jupiter as the eagle commanding the cosmos, as you can see. So, Italy, in this context, obviously, Italy, well, not so obviously necessarily, but Italy stood in the center of a world that it, in fact, fashioned through conquest and through rule And ultimately, this is the Mediterranean as dominated by Italy at the beginning of the early empire. And here is a very fine painting by a painter that many of you are familiar with, Jean-Leon Gérôme. It's called The Age of Augustus and the Birth of Christ. Fairly straightforward. It's another version of that painting by the British painter. Here you see the familiar scene of the Nativity, but the angel too draws their attention to the world in which the Nativity happens. Because of the opening of the Gospel of Luke, the Nativity is set within a particular moment as well as a particular place. It is a historical event. The transcendent erupting into the world of the here and now, and that's essentially what Gérôme is painting. As you know, Gérôme was a very great late 19th century French historical painter. Now, that world in its earlier incarnation is I have to
photo selected.
Sorry, I just have to undo what I did here so that it will work. Okay, this is entitled The Future Victims of the Colosseum by a painter of Polish ethnicity, but who painted within the Russian Empire in the late 19th century, Heinrich Hector Semiratsky. He was well known for his spectacular historical paintings. And here he shows the Apostle Peter preaching to an aristocratic audience, clearly aristocratic by the house, in the city of Rome at the time of Nero. And here's a more allegorical version of that subject. This is by Panini from 1791, currently in the Prado. The other apostle, St. Paul among the ruins. It's important to remember that there is no feast of St. Peter alone. Peter and Paul are celebrated together. They have the same feast day, both in the Roman Church and in the Eastern Church. They were buried originally in the same place. They may have been martyred at the same time. That fact is less clear. Okay, so that's the larger, political, cultural context. And the deeper theme here is that the cultural trumps the political. Now, closer to home, this is the title page of the first work of Western art history since antiquity, Vasari's Lives, from its second edition. This is the frontispiece. And we'll return to Vasari when we get discussing Michelangelo in his maturity. There's a mystery about why exactly Vasari set out to do this. There's an official story which, on the face of it, seems plausible, but doesn't provide much of a motivation. And I will argue, based on who Vasari sent his original copy to, and from the structure of the work, that it's very likely not only that it was dedicated to providing a context to Michelangelo's life and achievement, which it clearly does when you read it as a whole, but that there's a high degree of probability that it was in fact Michelangelo who initiated the project and guided its choice of subject matter. Now, here's a painting by another celebrated painter, British, Frederick Leighton, from the middle of the 19th century. and it could operate as another frontispiece for Vasari's work. It's entitled Cimabue's celebrated Madonna is carried in procession through the streets of Florence. It paints a scene in Vasari's life of Cimabue, and what is the significance of Cimabue in this context? Anybody know? It's the first life in Vasari's book. And in fact, it's chosen as the first life because Vasari argues that Cimabue is the first artist of the revolutionary new style that culminates in Michelangelo. Now, as it turns out, the painting, which can be recognized, even though it's in the extreme oblique, and there's a close-up, here's Cimabue, and he's surrounded by not just the worthies of Florence, but also his students and the artists that will come out of his atelier into the 14th century. So this is the icon that Vasari believed, and basically people believed until the later 19th century, to be a painting by Cimabue. Well, actually, this is the actual painting, but this is the painting that's depicted in the in Leighton's processional, and it's not by Cimabue, but it's by a Sienese painter, Duccio. So, Duccio comes a little bit later. He's not as old as Cimabue, but now that you're looking at this in the context of last week's lecture, what should be obvious about both the content and the form of these works? What is their origin? Indirectly, later Roman art. Directly, Roman art as currently practiced in the East, in Constantinople, and what's left of the eastern half of the empire. Here's an actual later painting by Duccio, a very damaged painting. Again, clearly representing what Vasari is drawing our attention to. Let's just say a greater degree of naturalism in the forms of the personages depicted in this iconography. And here is a contemporary painting, or close to contemporary, from the Orthodox East. This actually is from the series of monasteries on the peninsula known as Mount Athos, one of the monasteries still surviving there. So, they're not that far apart, but it's all in the difference, as we will continue to explore next week. So remember, you saw this one, again for contemporary context. This is a mosaic from Monreale, from the apse of the Madonna enthroned, which is the subject matter with the Christ child blessing. And the ultimate prototype is the Madonna and Child from the apse above the high altar in the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. There you see it in context. So, Central Italian art and culture in the centuries leading up to the Renaissance is both contemporary with, contiguous with, and largely influenced by the art of the metropolis of the Mediterranean, still at that time Constantinople. Nonetheless, there is another key figure, actually several more, in this great painting by Leighton, a pivotal figure. This fellow in the corner, leaning against the wall, looking onto the scene as an outsider because he was in exile. Do any of you recognize who this figure is? It's Dante. There is a fantastic painting of Dante, an allegorical painting between the Inferno and the Paradiso, in Purgatory, as it were, by Bronzino, from contemporary with Michelangelo in his maturity, that is 1530. So there's Purgatory. Oops. Obviously, this is representative of paradise and the transcendent. There's the where the journey began. And interestingly enough, we can recognize this figure. So that's a 16th century, this is a 15th century representation of Dante from Florence, from a fresco, almost 100 years earlier, well, more like 80 years earlier. And once again, you recognize the dome of the Duomo, the first monumental achievement of the early Renaissance. So, Dante, as I say, is a pivotal figure. In many ways, culturally, he represents the culmination of the High Middle Ages. And who was Dante's guide in this enterprise, at least through the first more than half to two-thirds of it? None other than the poet Virgil. So for Dante, ancient Roman literature and antiquity is contiguous with his world. His world is an extension of the ancient world. He feels no separation or difference from that world. Okay, so geographically, Italy, we're now going to step back in time, first looking at it. Empirically, Italy, as I said earlier, dominates the Mediterranean geographically. And if we go back further in time to the end of the last ice age, at one point it was the bridge from North Africa into Central Europe, literally. There was a land bridge. There were several land bridges. There was one at the site of the future Constantinople and another one on the Straits of Gibraltar. Eventually, as the ice receded sufficiently, there was a spectacular waterfall here that carved the separation of the Atlas Mountains from southern Spain, and then at a later stage, another spectacular waterfall that filled in the basin of the Black Sea, which some people attribute to the origin of the stories of Noah and the flood, the second. Okay, I chose this one basically just for its topography again. Italy is dominated in the north by the mountain range that is the home of Switzerland, the Alpine mountain range, and it has a mountain range that cuts through the center. There are two relatively flat areas, the Valley of the Po, and then basically the flat area around Rome. They're much smaller agricultural areas further down. So these are the Alps and these are the Apennines, and they extend all the way to Sicily, as you can see. Sicily is more mountainous. Okay, now going back going forward in time. So we're looking at the world at that moment that is the culminating moment of the first phase of world history, starting with the Paleolithic through the Neolithic that begins around 10,000 BC, and that culminates in the late Bronze Age, circa 1200 BC. So what happened circa 1200 BC is that the civilized world, which at that point was essentially, almost entirely this fertile crescent with civilization having gingerly moved into Asia Minor, Crete, and the Greek world. We're talking about the Cretan civilization, Mycenaean civilization, the Hittites, and a civilization that fluctuated, which is to say it came and went in the Indus Valley. Nothing much is going on in China, and pretty much nothing in the rest of the planet. These are all tribal groupings, still very much in the early Neolithic phase. So, there's a close-up of what I just described. The kingdom of the Hittites, the Hittites dominated the entirety of Asia Minor. The Proto-Greeks, the Mycenaeans, who had taken over Crete. And here we have the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the peoples who will ultimately give us the Persian Empire. And of course the Egyptians at their height. So the Near East at the moment of glory, and well, at this point, it's the Near East of Ramses II, the last great, undisputably great Egyptian ruler, and collapse. Now, it's still a big mystery why these civilizations suddenly experienced a catastrophic collapse. What is not a question is that the collapse was accompanied by vast destruction. Virtually all the cities of the Greek world, the entirety of central Anatolia, the Hittites vanished from the face of the earth. Many of the cities in the Fertile Crescent in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, all the way down to the Nile Valley, were destroyed over a period of several decades. Only the Nile escaped entirely, and that was thanks to the efforts of the last great ruler of the Egyptian world, Ramses III, and his predecessor. Okay, why do I now introduce this painting? Do you recognize the painter? You should. Yes, what is it a painting of? Homer, yes. Because the Homeric epics are in fact the result of this civilizational collapse. Which is to say that the world that Homer is describing is the world of the Late Bronze Age. His heroes are Late Bronze Age heroes. Troy is in fact an outpost of the Hittite Empire, and we now know a lot more about the Hittites thanks to the excavation of one of their two capitals and a huge treasure trove of writing which was preserved in ceramic there and which ultimately gives us a reconstructible history. We know that Troy was allied with the Hittites. In fact, we even know that the name of Troy as known to the Hittites, the Greeks called it Ilium, the Trojans called it William. From linguistics, we know that the letter and the sound W was lost between the end of the Bronze Age and as Greek emerged out of the Dark Ages. So it's embedded in the poetic structure of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but it's never vocalized. So, whatever one may conclude about Homer as an individual or as an author, as it were, for the Iliad and the Odyssey, the content of the Iliad and the Odyssey is based on a real world, a world that was only known in subsequent centuries in the memory that is embedded in these two epics. And the Odyssey is set very much at the beginning of the unraveling of that world, whereas the Iliad is set using material from the height of that world. This should be a familiar painting to you. Who's the artist? Rembrandt. And what is he doing? I mean, who is he showing? It's actually Aristotle with a bust of Homer. So we have that same bust that we were looking at here, which resides in the Louvre in Paris, and this is Rembrandt's representation of Aristotle. So remember, the theme is culture as well as rule in this world. At the heart of both the Greek, the Roman, and the ultimate later Christian European self-awareness and the culture that is built on this, at its very heart stands Homer, and there's no question about it. And out of this Homeric world ultimately emerges Greek philosophy, and for the High Middle Ages, the paradigmatic philosopher was not Plato, but in fact Aristotle. So foregrounding the content of his culture and civilization, this is what Rembrandt is representing. Now, we're going to zoom through this next section very quickly. Emerging out of the Dark Ages, the Greeks literally flowered and began to colonize much of the Mediterranean, southern Italy, as far as Spain and southern France, the entirety of the coasts of the Black Sea, even as far as North Africa and Egypt. Their only competition came from the Phoenicians, who set up a Phoenician superstate centered on Carthage, and the Etruscans, who are emerging here. And there's a tiny little city on the edge of the Etruscan world, which in 500 BC is of no consequence, but as we know, it will become very consequential. So this describes the same, only closer up, the Etruscan world, the Phoenician world, the Greek world. These are tribal areas, and the little city here known as Rome. So, so this is again circa 500 BC. The Carthaginians and the Etruscans and the Greeks are the important people. Meanwhile, the Romans are slowly consolidating their hinterland. So this represents the expansion of Rome between 500 and 300 BC. So quietly out of their way, they're literally on the edge of several worlds, but culturally they're Greek, as were the Etruscans. So circa 300 BC. Meanwhile, something huge has happened in another part of the world, which is the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander the Great. So this little group of city-states, first of all, is conquered by the northernmost of it, which is not a city-state, Macedon, and then using the resources of the whole of Greece, he goes on to defeat the then rulers of all of this, who were the Persians. Now, as you probably know, the Empire of Alexander the Great did not exactly last all that long as he imagined it. It broke up immediately at his death into these major four areas. His possible half-brother, certainly relative, Ptolemy, took the richest part, Egypt. The regent held on to Greece, and three of his generals divided the rest of the empire. And by the year 2000, this is essentially what that world looked like. There was a Greek empire centered around India. The relatives of the Persians, the Parthians, had taken over the center, and the Greeks continued to rule this portion of the Fertile Crescent for the next 100 years or so. Meanwhile, look at what's happened to Italy. Italy has been unified by this little city that stands in its center. So this is the Roman polity around the year 200 BC. Here we have the Carthaginians. You can guess what's going to happen next. War between the Carthaginians and the Romans for the domination of the Mediterranean basin. You know who won. Okay, there's a close-up of Italy. And the Carthaginians had the greater wealth, the greater military resources, and for a while the better generals. As you know, one of their generals almost conquered the whole of Italy, Hannibal. But in the end, the Romans prevailed. The ultimate last great prize was, so they prevailed by around 100 BC. They commanded the whole of the Mediterranean. They did not command the future territory of Gaul. That was left for one individual, and you can recognize who this is, Julius Caesar. And we know a lot about his conquest of Gaul because Julius Caesar was not only an amazingly successful military leader and political leader, he was also a writer, and he's left us with two books, each one of them not entirely preserved, but the Gallic Wars and then the Civil Wars is the second book. So this is a scene out of the Gallic Wars, the final defeat of the Gauls and their surrender. So, in the theme of empire, what is the significance of this moment? That the Gauls, once they were defeated, never rebelled again. Now, what this is indicative of is their degree of civilization as they were incorporated into the Roman Empire. They were civilized enough to know when they were decisively defeated, and that further resistance, as it were, would be futile, would only lead to the destruction of whatever had survived. And that's how Gaul became France and became one of the centers of Roman culture. Now, sadly, we're going to have to rush through the rest of this, and I'm going to zero into the time of Michelangelo in the High Middle Ages. By the way, this is a scale drawing showing the extent of the Roman Empire in relation to North America. The Mediterranean is not a negative here because movement of goods and people by boat was far faster and more efficient than movement across the land, and because across the land you basically had to walk. And so it was through the Mediterranean that trade largely operated from either ends of the empire. And this next image is showing the centers of Christianity at the time of Constantine and the expansion of Christianity by the time of the end of the empire around 400. So between 300 and 400. So the new reality in the world, of course, is symbolized by this image, which is a contemporary sculpture, a recent sculpture of Constantine in the city of York in eastern England. And here you see Constantine contemplating. It's a broken sword. This is the other view of the sculpture. Why York in England? Constantine was proclaimed emperor by the troops that had been previously the troops of his father, Constantius, and from northern England, Constantine went on to reclaim the rest of the empire, both for himself and for ultimately Christianity. And it's a drawing of the provinces of the empire. And a very good book which sketches this whole trajectory that I just quickly passed through is this. It's called The Birth of Classical Europe. It takes you from Homer, from Troy, to the culmination of the Christian Roman Empire around the year 400, represented by the works of St. Augustine. So it's from Homer to St. Augustine. It's in the Penguin History of Europe series. It's volume 1, very affordable. So, well, what happened to the Roman Empire? A series of ultimately unmanageable invasions triggered by movements in the Far East that ultimately resulted in the western half vanishing. And this is emblematic of the sack of Rome around the year 410, although not a true emblem. This is a far truer emblem. By the way, this is what the Romans looked like as their empire disintegrated. You should be a little surprised. What do these people look like? Don't they look rather medieval? Well, because the Romans were already rather medieval by the year between 400 and 500, when the Western Empire, or the government of the Western Empire, failed. Central Italy was taken over by a Germanic tribe called the Ostrogoths. And we're coming to the end of antiquity in central Italy. There was a brief Roman resurgence under Justinian a couple of decades later. We're now in the early 6th century. And this is the late Roman world, as beautifully represented by this painting by Alma Tadema. It represents the wife of the new ruler of much of the West, Clovis, a Frank. And she's looking at her children, her 3 sons, well, actually 2 of them. There's the youngest, 2 of the sons. They're training to be good Germanic warriors. But look at the setting. The setting is entirely Roman, because the Franks, like the Gauls and the Vandals, and all the other tribes that descended initially on the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, wanted to be Romans. They tried very hard to be Romans. They became acculturated Romans to a point. They ultimately embraced the Roman religion, in the case of the Franks, Catholic Christianity. However, this aspect of them never went away, and the subject matter of this painting is significant. It's called The Education of the Children of Clovis. Queen Clotilda, wife of King Clovis, is shown training her 3 young children so as to avenge the death of her father. She's training them to ultimate vengeance. And this is at the core of why these Germanic peoples never quite became Romans. They spent far too much in the business of, to use a more contemporary image, the Game of Thrones. And so it was this attrition which ultimately destroyed the civilizational fabric of the Western Empire. Centuries of continuous warfare, from 400 basically till the year 1000. It's a lot. In the meantime, the other catastrophe hit the Mediterranean world, the bubonic plague. As we'll see, the bubonic plague also hits the medieval world in the 14th century. But in the middle of the 6th century, coming out of the east, and it would appear that it is actually the bubonic plague and not another pestilence, took away at least from 1/3 to half the population of the resurgent Roman Empire. From Constantinople, Justinian had reconquered Italy, portions of Spain, much of North Africa. They looked like they were well on their way. The East had prospered in the previous 2 centuries. It was wealthy, it was strong agriculturally in terms of population. And then the first catastrophe. Well, catastrophes very often come in threes. So ultimately what this meant for Italy is that a new set of barbarians, known as the Longobards, we know them as the Lombards, descending from northern Germany. At this point, they were on the threshold of entering into the Mediterranean world, descended into Italy, and ultimately took over about half of Italy. The red is the remaining Roman territory. So, the unfolding second catastrophe is represented by these images. No, this is not the Islamic world. This is the late Persian world, known by their last pre-Islamic rulers, the Sasanians or the Sassanids, who were a revival of the Achaemenid Empire, pre-Alexander the Great. And the red is the Roman world. Shortly after the year 600, on the pretext, well, the details are certainly interesting, but not that significant for us, invaded and for the first time in literally centuries successfully took over much of Asia Minor. Here you see the victories of the Persians. They even besieged Constantinople. They extended themselves way too much. And this next image shows the Roman revival under their new emperor Heraclius, who left all this territory that they had occupied, took a fleet from Constantinople, landed on the northern shore of the Black Sea, and then went straight to the heart of the Persian Empire, which is at Ctesiphon, and ultimately the Persian resistance collapsed. So, the Romans were victorious. They seem to have survived this second catastrophe. Well, here we see the world at this point. There is a new civilization slowly emerging in China, as well as the revival of the Indus civilization in India, and that's about it for the rest of the world. So, what happened? After these two empires had fought each other to a bitter draw, a whole new people erupted out of the Arabian Peninsula. So remember, it was the people with cities who were ultimately damaged, first of all by the plague, and then by this incessant war. And both empires were fatally weakened. The Persians collapsed within 30 years, and the Romans ultimately lost Egypt, the entirety of their Middle East, the whole of North Africa, and this new entity, first the Umayyads and later their successors, the Abbasids, controlled a vast extent, now larger than the empires of Alexander and the Roman Empire combined. And this would be the ultimate incursion of Islam into Europe, both from the east and the west. They would control much of southwestern France, and as you'll see, the Ottomans will gobble up half of Central Europe as well. Okay, so that is going to be the green on the maps. So, meanwhile, in the west, there was a revival. The Merovingians around the year, okay, I have to zip through this here quickly. The Lombards created a kingdom that ruled largely northern Italy and various Lombardic dukedoms in central and southern Italy, and this is their crown. It's called the Iron Crown of Italy. There's no iron in this crown, and in fact, this crown can be seen, a replica of it in the Pantheon in Rome, gracing this very elegant tomb of the second last Italian king, Umberto I, who was assassinated in the year 1900, and there you see a replica of it. As it turns out, this crown is actually ancient Roman, possibly parts of it go back to the 5th century AD. It was refashioned sometime around the 8th century AD and used to crown the kings of Italy from about the years 1000 to the 20th century. So, what happened to northern Italy? So the new players on the block, of course, are Charlemagne and his successors, the Carolingians. And the Carolingians defeat the Lombards, at least the northern Italian Lombards, and they ultimately give to the Pope in Rome the former territories of the East Romans that the East Romans had basically held until about the year 750. And so we have the beginning of the Papal State. The Papal State is the territory ruled from Rome that was understood to be nonetheless a part of the Carolingian Empire. There you see the Carolingian Empire at its height. Its height was the last years of Charlemagne, so we're into the early first decade of the 9th century. It wouldn't stay this way for a very simple reason. One of the ancient German laws of inheritance is that the property of a dead German is divided equally amongst the sons. So, Charlemagne, ruling all this revived Western Empire, nonetheless is understood that this is his personal property. Fortunately for Charlemagne, most of his sons, except for one, died before he died. So, his one surviving son inherited the whole of Charlemagne's domain, but Charlemagne was very old at this point. He had 4 surviving grandsons. So his son had to divide up the territory into 4. And this division ultimately leads to the divisions of later Europe. Zoom forward. Okay, so another catastrophe hits this empire that is being politically divided and subdivided with the death of every one of these heirs to Charlemagne, the Vikings. The Vikings are a plague that hits Europe from the north for no particular known reason. Actually, there is a known reason. The previous people who built boats like this go back to Roman times. The Vikings around the year 800, when Charlemagne is being crowned in Rome, have figured out a way to securely tie a mast to the hull, which ultimately means that they can be seagoing and even ocean-going mariners. And they're not just tied to rivers and to rowing up and down. So that's what this image is meant to represent. But because these boats are very shallow draft, they can go deep into the territory of Europe. This is just their incursions into France in the 9th century. So, this is a catastrophe. Well, the Vikings have their charming aspects. One of them is storytelling. This is a Russian painting showing a number of Eastern Vikings listening to their great exploits, and here's one of their bards, as it were a Northern European version of Homer, and a fair bit of these tales in their final iteration in the 10th and 11th centuries have come down to us in writings, so we know a fair bit. These are all the territories in Europe that were hit by the Vikings and ultimately settled. We have 2 Viking states, which, other than the homeland, which have survived into modern times. One of them is England, of course, conquered by the Normans, who were Vikings. The other is Rus, Rus is actually a Viking word that gives rise to the Russian state. However, another group was hitting Central Europe at the same time. Not the Huns, but their descendants, the Magyars. We know them as the Hungarians. Here they are, another, as it were, efficient hunter-gatherer group surveying Central Europe. And this is a drawing of their marauding in Europe that is contemporary with that of the Vikings. Now, what's extraordinary about these two catastrophic collisions is that the Carolingians and their successors, the Ottonians who created the Holy Roman Empire, survived. In other words, what was not true of the Romans was true of this revived Christian sort of Roman Empire, that in spite of these disastrous 2 centuries, by the year 1000, through the strength of the religious and material culture, they were ultimately able to tame both the Magyars and the Norsemen by turning them into good Catholic Christians. So this represents the triumph of the West in the year 1000. And this is the book which tells the story of all of this in a very accessible way. It's called The Forge of Christendom. This is a more popular history by Tom Holland, who's a very good writer. I don't particularly like all his books, but this is one of the 2 books that I think is very fine and a very good introduction to all of this. And so this is what the world looked like we're going to stop here in a minute or so. In the year 1000, the Holy Roman Empire, the emerging Kingdom of France, the Kingdom of England. Spain is moving ever more southward, pushing the Muslims out of Spain. There's still a remnant of the Roman Empire in the east that controls a bit of the Balkans and most of Asia Minor, and it will do well for another 7 decades before it's catastrophically crippled. And also around the year 1000, the Russians are also converted to Christianity, but converted by the East Romans rather than by the Germanic Romans. And another more detailed book, very readable, but focusing more on the religious side of this revival, is this book by Princeton professor Peter Brown, known as The Rise of Western Christendom. Goes back to late Roman times until the year 1000. So I heartily recommend these 2 books. And in the closing images of the year 1000 this is a ivory plaque of the coronation of Otto II with his new bride, who is a East Roman, and their hoped for union of East and West, and their child Otto III. Here's an image of Otto III. Well, sadly, it was not to be. Both Otto II and Otto III died of a characteristic Italian illness, malaria. Otto II in his 20s, Otto III became a child ruler, ruled through his mother and then later through his aunt, and his sole rule lasted for 5 years, and he also died he was around 21, 22, also of malaria. And central Italy was thrown into chaos, but to show that, in fact, the West Holy Romans, the Germanic Romans, are very East Roman, here is an ivory showing a contemporary coronation scene from Constantinople. So an exact contemporary to Otto II, the Roman Emperor Romanus II, and his Empress Eudokia being crowned. And to make the point, the greatest city in the Mediterranean remained the city that Constantine founded circa 330, that in the year 1000 was the prosperous and the largest city in the Mediterranean basin, that probably had 500,000 to 800,000 inhabitants in the year 1000, and was, of course, a great magnet for people who wanted to conquer it. And here's an image of a ruler of this time. This represents Basil II, who by the year 1025 was well on his way to reconquering the Holy Land, expelling the Muslims from southern Italy and Sicily, and, as it were, reforming the revived empire of Justinian. Unfortunately, he made one catastrophic mistake. Here's his empire at the time when he dies. He didn't get married. We don't know why. He was a warrior. Well, he was constantly at war, fighting all the enemies north, south, east, and west. He had a younger brother who was going to succeed him. Unfortunately, the younger brother only had daughters. So, Game of Thrones, it ultimately causes a fatal weakness that gives rise, okay, here's the world at the year 1000, that gives rise to, well, to many disasters. So, just shortly after his death is the formal schism culturally between East and West, with the separation of, well, essentially, let's just say, a profound misunderstanding that was never resolved between Rome and Constantinople. There were at least two major attempts at reunion, one in the 13th and another one in the 15th century, and both were failures, and so the two churches, as you know, are still apart. So in religious, cultural terms, here's the world in the 11th century. The whole of North Africa and the East is dominated by Islam. The fatal moment for Byzantium has already occurred with the eruption of the Turks into Asia Minor. The kingdoms of Aragon and Castile are beginning they're halfway through their reconquest of Sicily. So as things move this way, things are going to move that way. So this is the eruption of the Turks into the Mediterranean basin. They took over much of they destroyed the remnants of the Abbasids. They were converted to Islam, and so they replaced them, and ultimately will give us the Ottoman Empire. And here's one painting that represents this moment when the Byzantines, desperate for help, asked their somewhat estranged cousins in the West for help. And here we have the French, largely, who have arrived in Constantinople and are pledging to help the East Romans recover Anatolia. The reigning emperor, Alexis I, who stabilized the situation. He fortunately ruled for 40 years, and the Crusades. Well, the Westerners weren't really interested in helping the East Romans. They were more interested in carving out territory for themselves and quarreling with each other. So ultimately, only the First Crusade was successful, and the Fourth Crusade focused, instead of on the Holy Land, on Constantinople itself, and the city was captured and sacked. And I'll close with this image by Delacroix. Here are the Crusaders entering the city, sacking it, robbing it, and the main beneficiary of all of this was another former East Roman city that we know as Venice. So Some of the surviving treasures of East Rome can be found in the treasury of St. Mark's if you go upstairs. You have to pay a little bit, but there are spectacular remnants, booty from this sack. And another piece of booty from this sack also is the Shroud of Turin. Somehow the knights who ended up ruling the Piedmont in northwestern Italy acquired this cloth that has this mysterious image on it that became their talisman, and as you know, they ultimately conquered the whole of Italy in the 19th century. Okay, so I will pick up from here, talk about the city-states, how it was that Italy was divided up into those rather energetic polities that became the crucible of the Renaissance next time. So, thank you.